Hi everyone, I'm Synthia Cognita.
And I'm Felix Logis. Welcome to today's episode of the Autonomous Brief Political Edition, where we break down the biggest political stories of the day.
And boy, do we have some stories to discuss today, Felix. The Trump administration is making waves with some controversial moves on immigration and deportation.
That's right, Cynthia. Trump has invoked a rather obscure wartime law called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to justify mass deportations of Venezuelan migrants suspected of being members of the Tren de Aragua gang.
What's interesting is that according to our sources, there's actually very little evidence to support these gang membership claims. In fact, experts are saying the group's influence has been greatly exaggerated.
That's correct. The reporting shows there's no reliable way to identify Tren de Aragua members, and even the tattoos and symbols supposedly used to identify them are inconsistent.
And here's where it gets even more concerning: they're carrying out these deportations despite a federal judge ordering them to stop. Talk about executive overreach?
It's definitely raising some serious constitutional questions. But what's particularly troubling is how this ties into broader surveillance of protesters and activists.
Oh, right, the LAPD story. According to The Intercept, police have been using a tool called data miner to monitor Gaza-related protests and other constitutionally protected speech on social media.
This kind of surveillance has civil liberties groups extremely worried. And speaking of protests, we're seeing some interesting developments with Reform UK and Nigel Farage.
Yes, despite some internal party drama, Farage just announced 29 new councillors joining Reform UK. Though there seems to be some tension, didn't he mention something about racism within the party?
He did. He specifically called out what he described as online abuse and outright racism directed at Reform's chair, Zia Yousaf, though he claims it wasn't from actual party members.
Let's shift gears to some domestic policy. The UK is making some controversial moves regarding disability benefits.
Indeed, the government is trying to walk a very fine line between cutting costs and protecting vulnerable citizens. According to the reporting, they're looking to save around £5.6 billion through changes to personal independence payments and universal credit.
But critics are saying this could hurt those who need help the most, right?
Exactly. Labour MPs are particularly concerned about the impact on vulnerable populations. And speaking of benefits, we're seeing similar debates in the US with Trump's recent move regarding federal contractors.
Right, he just nixed that $17.75 minimum wage requirement for federal contractors that Biden had put in place. That's going to affect quite a few workers.
And it's interesting timing, given the current economic climate. We're also seeing some significant developments in Ukraine policy.
Yes, and this is crucial according to our sources. Ukraine has received about $136 billion in military support from allies since Russia invaded, with the US providing about half of that.
But there's growing concern about the sustainability of this support, especially with potential changes in US leadership and policy direction.
You know what's fascinating about all these stories? They all seem to connect to this larger theme of shifting political priorities and values.
Absolutely. Whether it's immigration policy, social benefits, or international aid, we're seeing some fundamental debates about the role of government and national priorities.
And speaking of priorities, before we wrap up, I think it's worth mentioning the Kentucky story about GOP lawmakers voting to protect conversion therapy.
Yes, that's a significant development that seems to go against the national trend of banning such practices. It's another example of how state-level politics can sometimes move in the opposite direction of broader national movements.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. Thank you all for joining us.
And remember to tune in tomorrow for more analysis of the day's biggest political stories. I'm Felix Logis.
And I'm Synthia Cognita. This has been the Autonomous Brief Political Edition. Good night.